I remember, I'm old enough to remember, when you couldn't buy anything on Sunday. Anybody else remember those days? Yeah, quite a few of you. I remember when only people who had critical jobs like hospitals would work on Sunday. Anybody remember those days? I remember when I was growing up that my parents had very strict expectations about my activity and behavior on Sundays. For instance, the morning was church. It just didn't even make any sense to even argue with them, because it was like arguing against breathing or arguing against having your heart beat. It was like it was Sunday morning, you went to church. Who even questioned it? You could say that you were sick, but if you said you were sick, you might be allowed to stay home from church, but you would also be in your bedroom, in bed, for the rest of the day, and there would be no watching the wonderful world of Disney at 7 o'clock in the evening. So you saved that for school. And then, the interesting thing in my house anyway was, after we had a family dinner, which was usually something pretty fancy, I was free to go and play with my friends. I could go hang out at their house. We could play some, obscure military strategy game in Matt Collins' basement, one of those B words. Or we might go to the park and hang out all day, exploring through the woods, building dams across the river, other boy things that we would do. So it wasn't like Sunday was absolutely all about religious stuff in my house, but what I could not do was work on my homework on Sunday afternoon. What I could not do is postpone my weekend chores till Sunday afternoon. There would be no lawn mowing. There would be no garage cleaning. There would be no working on work. So the Sabbath I grew up thinking the Sabbath was actually like an important thing. But in this day and age, it's entirely different. If in the time that I was growing up, and I'm pretty sure when most of you were growing up, if some coach said that there was going to be a soccer practice or a soccer game or a basketball game or anything else on a Sunday, every adult head in town would have exploded simultaneously. And that would not have happened. It's a different world. You can go to Walmart, you can go to Kmart, you can go to Target, you can go to the grocery store, you can go to the pharmacy, you can go any place and buy anything, except if you live in Indiana, you can't buy alcohol on Sunday. And I'll tell you the story about buying communion wine one Sunday morning some other time. They rang it up as produce. But it used to be that in human memory, that the Sabbath was an important and sacred idea. And now it is just not important at all. It's not even on the radar, even among devout Christian persons like yourself. It's not even on the radar. And so it leads you to wonder a bunch of things. One thing it makes you wonder is, why was it ever a big deal? I mean, why would God, in the 10 Commandments, these are like the foundational concepts of Jewish law, why would one of them be about taking a day off? It seems like there might be other more important moral issues that would come up. So that's kind of a question. Why is the Sabbath in Scripture, both Old and in New Testament, why is the Sabbath such a critical thing? And I think it has to do with what it means to be a human being. Now, I have a hunch that this might be slightly different for women than it is for men, but at least guys, if you're meeting somebody for the first time, after you exchange names with each other, what is the first thing you ask that other person? Anybody? What do you do? What's your work? As if that is the most important thing that that defines us as men, but I assume also to a certain extent you as women, especially as you've taken your rightful place in the workforce. And in this day and age, what we do is very closely associated with who we are. And especially if we're male and we lose our jobs, it is really hard to hold on to our self-esteem. Because a certain part of our brain says, if you're not working out in the world, making money for your family and supporting your kids, you're not a real man. And even if we know all the reasons why we're not currently working and it's hard to find a job, that voice in the back of our head, that voice of the culture, is really strong. You are what you do. And if you don't do something, you aren't anyone. Our work defines us. Which might be a clue as to why Scripture thinks that the Sabbath is a critical aspect of being a human being. Because the Sabbath law says there are 6 days to do work. And there's one day on which you do not do work. Your life is comprised of 7 days a week, and your work life is comprised of 6 days a week. What the Sabbath commandment does is it says in no uncertain terms that your life is more than what you do. That you are not a human doing. You are, in fact, a human being. This is why the Old Testament is so insistent, and the Jewish law is so insistent on the keeping of the Sabbath. Not because it's a rule that has to be kept. Not because God is just being arbitrary, but because it is a reminder. It is a protection of your identity as a human being and not a human doing. And we know that this is important because it is the one commandment that Jesus is really clear about breaking. It's the one commandment that Jesus is really clear about pushing the envelope, because in the time of Jesus, the Pharisees have turned this commandment, which is about protecting the dignity of a human being, protecting the identity of a human being as more than what they do and the labor that they produce, and have made it into a rule to constrict human activities, even good and life-giving ones. Jesus breaks the Sabbath commandment not because he's some kind of a radical iconoclast who doesn't like to follow the rules. He breaks the rule in order to show us what the rule is meant to be. He pushes the Pharisees' envelope by taking his hungry disciples through the field and allowing them to glean and eat, because he knows it's going to annoy the Pharisees. Now, the Pharisees aren't bad people. They really aren't. They're good people, but they are totally misdirected about what righteousness in the face of God means and what it can possibly accomplish. The Pharisees believed that there was the 10 Commandments, and then the laws of Moses and the tradition around that, and that it was the job of the rabbis to build a fence around the Torah, to build a fence around the law. And further, just in case that fence might have a hole in it or might break down, it was also their job to build a fence around the Torah, so that it would be impossible to accidentally break a law, break a rule. But Jesus understands that he needs to kick down those two fences with regard to the Sabbath, because by fencing it in, everyone has lost sight of the fact that the Sabbath was created for human beings, not vice versa. So it's interesting that Jesus chooses this law to really push against, not because he disagrees with it or thinks it's unimportant, but precisely because it is important. That we need to get to the living core of the Sabbath commandment in order that we know how important it is. And we know that it's important in Jesus' time because the Pharisees and their allies choose that issue. Did you hear what Mark said? They said he asks them a question, they say nothing. And then they go out and begin to plot how they might oppose him in order to destroy him. He threatens the very core of what and who they are and what they value. So Jesus chooses the Sabbath. They choose the Sabbath as the place where they will meet, precisely because the commandment about respecting the day of rest is so critical to what it means to be a faithful human being. So in the 21st century, we have pretty much made the Sabbath a non-event and a non-issue. And we shop on Sunday. And we work on Sunday. And we practice and play soccer and basketball and baseball and football and everything else, not just on Sunday afternoon, but on Sunday morning. And everything in our culture says, this is not important. It's important. Why is it important? First, because it defines us as human beings rather than human doings. But what else does the Sabbath commandment do? It points us back to God's activity in the creation of the world. God labors for 6 days to create the world. God creates light, separates night from day. God creates land and separates it from the waters. God creates living beings. God creates human beings. Everything in the cosmos is created. And then Genesis tells us God sat down, put his feet up. God took a deep breath. God looked around at it and said, yeah, it's really good. Something about not only the act of creation, but the act of appreciating the work that God has done is essential to the very nature of who God is. Just like God is love and isn't just one who loves, God is creating. He isn't just one who creates. It is central to who God is to create and to make and to do, and then also to appreciate what God has done and made and worked on. And Genesis tells us in no uncertain terms that one of the critical basic aspects of being a human being is that we are the image bearers of God. That our lives, the way we conduct our lives, the way we live, the way we engage in all of the activities of life, we are intended to reflect and to bear the image of God into the world. And that is at the root of why this commandment about taking a day off is in the Ten Commandments, and why it is at the very root of the law of Moses, and why it is at the heart of Jesus' ministry in the world, is because in observing Sabbath, we bear the image of God into the world. We reflect not just the love of God, but the nature of God into the world. The Sabbath is not a small thing. And then did you see what else both Jesus and Deuteronomy, I think it was mostly Deuteronomy, talked about in conjunction with the keeping of the Sabbath? The slavery of the children the slavery of the children of Israel in Egypt. Why must we keep the Sabbath holy? Because you were slaves in Egypt. And God brought you into freedom. And for that reason, you must keep the Sabbath holy. And not only must you keep the Sabbath holy, but the people who work for you must keep the Sabbath holy. The people whose labor you own, as in slaves, must keep the Sabbath holy. You must not work on Sunday. You must not cause your slaves to work on the Sabbath. You must not make your animals work on the Sabbath. It's radical. It's radical. And why must you not do those things? Because once upon a time, you were slaves in Egypt. Think about what it means to be a slave. A slave means you are a person who exists for the good of some other person. You are a person whose labor entirely belongs to another person. They don't have to pay you. They don't have to limit the hours that you work. They don't need to give you a day off or any vacations or anything. If you are a slave, you are not a person. If you are a slave, you are not an image bearer. It is the commandment about the Sabbath that undergirds, that is the foundation for the notion that human beings ought not to be slaves. That human beings are more important than the labor they do, whether as slaves or whether as wage earners. You are more than what you do. And if you suddenly stop working because of an injury or because of a plant closing or because of any other reason, you are still an image bearer. You are still in the image of God. You are still valuable simply because of who you are, quite apart from anything that you may do or not do. Remember the Sabbath to keep it holy. It's all about actually protecting your dignity and your neighbor's dignity and your children's dignity and your employees' dignity as image bearers of God, as the children of God. The Sabbath itself is the fence that protects who we are and what we are and the intrinsic value that we hold as human beings, as created creatures of God, and as the redeemed of the Lord. So I don't know what to tell you to do because the whole culture is against you. Your kids want to be on that soccer team and they can't do it if they don't practice on Sunday, and I don't know what to tell you to do about that. You have a job and sometimes it requires you to work on Sundays, and I don't know what to tell you about that, and I'm not going to judge you for it. It's not as easy as that. But we do need to find ways, little by little, bit by bit, to claim the Sabbath back. Maybe it doesn't have to be Sunday. Maybe we don't all have to have it on the same day. But somehow we must reclaim the concept of the Sabbath, that thing which says you have value, whether you work or whether you don't. You are not what you do. So I'm calling on you. It's time to take back the Sabbath. And it's probably going to be not a frontal assault. It's probably going to be a lot of under the surface, cutting away at the foundations of the culture. It might be about giving your employees opportunities to observe Sabbath, even though it might not be the most profitable choice, but it will be a subversive activity on our part. Let's do it.